Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Lake Doctor podcast. I'm Susie Light and my co-host, Dr. Nate Bosch, an official lake nerd.
Yes, that's right, Susie. I received my doctorate from the University of Michigan in limnology, which is the study of freshwater lakes. In today's episode, we have Nathan Herbert. He's the land manager with the Nature Conservancy.
And we're going to learn where the best stand of trillium is in Kosciusko County in the springtime. We're excited about today's episode. The doctor is in. Thanks for joining us today for the Lake Doctor podcast. Nathan Herbert, thank you for joining us. And I hear you're a herper. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, thanks for the welcome. I'm glad to be here. I guess. I mean, I just basically recreationally and professionally occasionally work with reptiles and amphibians.
So that's herpetology?
Herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians, yeah. Yeah, and so, I like to go out and, since I've been a little kid, I go out and look for them. I grew up in Southwest PA, just sort of at the base of Chestnut Ridge, which is the westernmost ridge of the Appalachians in Pennsylvania. And pretty much as long as I've been on 2 feet and able to go outside, that's what I do is I go outside and I turn over rocks and I was finding things and I'd come home with, it's like Dennis the Menace. I'd come home with pockets full of snakes and things like that.
Your mom must have been a saint.
They're easier to catch than birds and things
That's
like
true.
that. And so I think that for a lot of people that are into herpetology and reptiles and amphibians, it's like, that's an easy in because what's the turtle going to do? It can't run away.
Okay, so who pays you to be a herpetologist?
Well, no one pays me to be a herpetologist specifically now. In the past, I've worked with organizations that my work with them was to focus on, inventorying and finding rare rare reptiles and amphibians and participating in studies. My graduate degree, my master's degree from Purdue, focused on studying the ecology of water snakes. And while I'm not really a herpetologist anymore compared to actual herpetologists in academia and things like that, I try to remain as peripherally engaged as I can, through helping out with research. I go up to Michigan every year and I help out with a long-term study of Massasauga rattlesnakes. I assist with, recovery plans for other rare snakes in the tri-state area. And I try to remain engaged as much as I can in my current job with the Nature Conservancy.
So what do you get to do with the Nature Conservancy?
I am the Northeast Indiana. My title is the Northeast Indiana Conservation Lands Manager. It's a long phrase that basically just means I take care of our properties and our protected areas, our nature reserves in Northeast Indiana. Kosciusko County is one of them, but also Elkhart, Noble County, LaGrange to Bend, DeKalb. I represent TNC and help pursue our conservation interests in these areas as well.
So what are the properties in Kosciusko County that you get to shepherd?
The two properties that we have in Kosciusko County that I take care of are Oppenheim Woods and Burkett Bog. And Oppenheim Woods is near Lake Tippecanoe. It's a 62-acre tract of forest that was bequeathed to us by your friend, Pat Oppenheim.
And her late husband, yes.
That's correct. And so I take care of that place, and it's open to the public to go visit. It's a rarity in northern Indiana because it has some of the oldest trees you're likely to see, especially in northeast Indiana. It's one of those special places where you step into, you kind of get a feel for maybe what the forests look like pre-settlement. Not really. When you read about the forests in Indiana, they had to be spectacular. Everywhere, pre-settlement.
You and I got to do an interpretive hike there together a few years ago, and you're right, it is a beautiful, remarkable place.
Right.
But there are accounts of from early surveying work in the early 1800s of tulip trees that were 11 feet in diameter. And we don't see that big of trees in that woods, but it still is pretty impressive.
Right.
So the trees in the Oppenheim Woods, what kind of trees would I see when I go there?
So it's a mixed hardwood forest, which means that you're going to see maples, oaks of different species. There's a lot of sugar maple. There's a lot of beech. And then oaks of different species. Predominantly, the main oak that you'll see of any size is red oak. But there's also tulip poplars in there, hickory. And then a lot of other trees that I guess just don't really get the credit that that the oaks and the hickories and things do, things like hackberry, black cherry, things like that. But what's remarkable about it is that when the Oppenheims purchased it, my understanding, and maybe you can correct me, I'd love to get the straight story from somebody that knew Pat Oppenheim. As I understand it, that when the Oppenheims purchased it, it was being looked at for subdivision and development. They lived next to it. They didn't want to see that happen, so they purchased this tract of forest. And they basically sat on it for the next 60 years. And so this is a section of forest, a section of Kosciusko County that didn't get logged in the first half of the 1900s, and had already had old trees on it at the time, and then was not disturbed or logged after that. And so there are trees in there that we verified through, boring into the trunk. I went in with Justin Maxwell, who's a dendrochronologist with IU. I don't know if he's still there. And we have trees in that forest that are in the 180 to 225 year age class. So that's a pretty old tree for Northeast Indiana.
Right. So one of the things you work on are ecosystems, and you've labeled this as an old ecosystem.
Well, I think that we should probably be cautious when we use words like old and things like that. It's certainly not old growth, and that term in itself doesn't really have a clear meaning. I don't think it's a very useful term when we talk about woods. I think it's mostly, kind of a nice marketing term for a forest, right? It's certainly not virgin. It's certainly not remnant, right? It was definitely logged at some point, right? But it's probably, for portions of the forest, it's been at least 200 years since it was logged.
Which would make sense, because when Indiana was becoming a state and there was a lot of surveying work done in the early 1800s, that was right along when a lot of the logging was happening in Indiana, right? And so maybe even it was logged at that time, but still you'd have 200 years then after that, if it was untouched after that, for these trees to grow up to the age they are.
Yeah. It's, a good synopsis of Indiana's forests is the beginning of Marion T. Jackson's book, Natural Heritage of Indiana. And, Nate, they talk about that. Marion Jackson talks about that at the beginning. There were, I forget, 150 some species of trees in Indiana. Some of them, of course, are gone or disappearing. And you're talking about average trunk diameters across species of 5 to 7 feet. They talk about, certain trees that have a predisposition to get really big, like a sycamore. I think down near Kokomo or something, there was a sycamore whose stump was 50, and it's measured, so this is verified, 56 feet in circumference.
Wow.
And I think maybe portions of that stump are preserved. 20 million acres of forest like that in Indiana. A lot of it beech maple, right? Climax beech maple forest. And Kosciusko is right in the mix of it.
Yeah, let's talk about that idea of climax, because when we look at different ecosystems, we have sort of an eventual stage as those ecosystems get older in what we would call kind of a climax stage. In a forest in Indiana, my understanding is we would have either beech maple or oak hickory would be kind of two options. Like how would a forest move in one or the other direction? And is it really that cut and dry of those two categories?
Yeah, this goes into realms that maybe I'm not exactly an expert on. But my understanding is that, oak hickory is, obviously it's going to depend on, hydrology, soils, things like that. But also oak hickory tends to be more of a cereal forest.
Explain what that means.
Okay, so it's a successional forest, right? And so if we have a big stand of beech maple and a tornado comes through, right, or any sort of disturbance, a fire or something like that, and wipes it out, you get what's called succession, secondary succession, right? It's no different than if you have like an agricultural field that gets taken out of production, and then it becomes an old field, and then shrubs grow in, right? And over time, it returns to forest. That can take centuries, right? And so with oak hickories are fire-dependent forests a lot of times. And so if you have forest in an area that's getting, a return interval of fire that's appropriate to sort of suppress beech maples, it will remain oak hickory.
Got it.
Right? Oaks and hickories are adapted, their bark and so forth, they have adaptations to withstand the fire. But without that regular disturbance, whether it's wind disturbance or fire or whatever, right, the trend is going to be to transition into beech maple. And then beech maple sits there as the climax community until disturbance comes through and opens up room for oaks and hickories and other species again.
And this relates to one of our earlier episodes with Nate Simons talking about oak savannas and prairies and that continuum of sometimes you have more oak trees kind of with hickories closer together, which would be more of the forest side of the continuum, or more just of those tall grass prairie stands with no trees, which would be the other side of the continuum. But much of Indiana was somewhere between those two extremes where there were some oaks and hickories kind of spaced out, almost like a parkland sort of an idea where you have a few trees with the grasses kind of underneath the canopy.
Yeah. And if you go, like Indiana was populated, or we'll say colonized and cleared basically from southeast towards northwest. And so if you look across the state at the soils, the geology, even there are remnants of Indiana's natural history, even in the names of things. But if we were to look generally speaking across the state, right, you would see eastern deciduous forest, 20 million acres. That dominated most of the state, early on, before settlement. In 70 years, those forests were all but gone, right? People got to work clearing the land. But as you go west, you start to grade from denser forests into, more grassland, woodlands, savannas, prairies. You start to see grasslands popping up here and there. If you go, and we're going to go outside of Kosciusko, but if you go on 20 and you take Highway 20 out of Angola, like across the state, the terrain and topography is very rolling because of all the glacial deposit, all the sand and gravel that the receding glaciers drop. But you'll see names like Prairie Heights High School, Brushy Prairie, right? If you look at the soil maps, you'll see that, especially in these glaciated regions, and Kosciusko County is in the heart of the glaciated region, you see these really mosaic sort of like, especially if the soil map's got a lot of color, right? It looks like a quilt of all these different soil types, right? And some of those soils are really good for supporting forest. Some of those soils are good for supporting wetlands. Some of those soils, they're for grasslands and things like that.
And we in Kosciusko County have two townships in the middle of Kosciusko County, one called Prairie and one called Plain.
Yeah.
So I think that's those remnant names like you were talking about.
And one called Clay.
Which would indicate what was
the soil
there.
type.
Right. And so you start to see around LaGrange County, Kosciusko County, maybe in the Noble County, you know what I mean? But as you go west, you start to see those openings, right? All dictated by, historical soils and glaciation. But historically, you would start to see those openings in the forest as we start to grade into more grassland on the west side of the state.
So does a forest have like a life cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it does. So it gets back to that idea of succession, right? So in a vacuum, right? We'll take out invasive species. We'll take out, human disturbance, and things like that. In a vacuum, it's disturbance, sort of wipes the slate clean, depending on the severity of the disturbance, right? So like succession, glaciers would create a situation of primary succession, where you're basically at bedrock and you have to rebuild the soil, right? Glaciers create a situation of primary succession. Extremely severe fire can create a similar thing because it burns up the organic mass in the soil and basically deadens the soil, right? So primary succession is sort of like working from a bare slate. Secondary succession is where you have some intact soil, you have an organic component to the soil, and so you're working off of seed banks and things like that. And if we think about the life cycle of a forest, we can go back to that idea of imagine what happens if you take a manicured lawn or if you take an agricultural field out of production, right? You know the next year it's going to be weedy and there's going to be a lot of really opportunistic things. And that situation is going to increase. And eventually you'll start to see shrubs popping up in there. Again, we're going to leave out the invasive shrubs for now, right?
Thank you.
And you'll start to see, pioneers tree species moving in, tree species that have the ability to take advantage rapidly of clearings and openings. A sycamore is a good example of that. Box elder is an example of that. You start to see these pioneer tree species. And so that would be, you could consider, okay, this is the forest just starting with these pioneer tree species, right? And then over time, you have other tree species. Cottonwoods are another really good example of a pioneer tree species.
Even wild black cherry.
Yes. Yeah, because the birds. And so we think about seed dispersal, right, on the wind or in birds. And then that can be considered like the beginnings of the forest life cycle, right? And then over time, you have other trees that move in, oaks and hickories, who have a different sort of life history, a different growth strategy. They stay low and slow for a few years, 5 to 10 years, and then they start to go up, right? So they establish a really good root system. And as the oaks and hickories are moving in, then like we say, it starts to grade oak hickory, mixed hardwood, transitioning over towards like a climax forest situation.
And climax means dying?
No, climax just means that is the end stage of sort of succession.
And often stable. So even if there is some minor disturbances coming through, it keeps kind of going back to that same eventual stage.
Right.
So do lakes have that kind of life cycle, Nate?
Yeah, so quite different, but also some similarities. So a lake, if we think again of a glacially formed lake, which most of our lakes in Kosciusko County and northern Indiana would be glacially formed lakes, you would scour that area out, or you have a big chunk of ice that's left behind, which would form a kettle lake as that ice melts and then that depression fills with water. And so you start from an early stage, like the successional stages that Nathan was just talking about. It could be all the way back to primary succession. And so you have very clear water, a deep blue color to the water, not a lot of particles in the water, probably not a lot of fish in the early age of a lake because you don't have a lot of nutrients built up yet to really get the food chain going. And not a lot of muck on the bottom. It's going to be a rocky or gravelly, maybe sandy bottom, whatever was left by the glacier initially. But then over time, you're going to start to get some muck building up, some of the organic matter similar to, so you see in a forest, because the plants and animals are going to die. They're going to sink to the bottom and they're going to be dying and sinking faster than they can decompose. And so that organic matter is going to start to build up over time. So the lake gets shallower. It's also going to start to get more green or brown in color, not that deep blue anymore, because now you have more particles. You've got algae, you've got sediment particles, you've got zooplankton swimming around in there. And you're going to have more plants growing around the margins because, again, we've got more nutrients around there. Those plants are going to have the feedback then of building up the bottom sediment faster again. So it's going to get shallower over time. And then eventually the lake will become really shallow and become a wetland where you've got shallow enough that plants, emergent plants span all the way across the lake. Now you're not going to be able to have fish in there, or maybe just fish like carp or catfish or something like that. And the lake then could go further into wet prairie, forest, and into the successional stages that Nathan was just talking about.
Yeah.
But that takes a long time. But as I'm guessing in the case of some of the terrestrial environments you work in, I know in the case of aquatic environments, people can speed that up. So that process of a lake filling in and getting older is called eutrophication, but there's something called cultural eutrophication, whereby excess nutrients coming into the lake from the outside, we can make that lake get older faster than it naturally would.
And does that occur without human intervention, or is that driven by humans?
Eutrophication happens naturally. So over time, we're going to have more productivity in the lake as more nutrients come in from the watershed around, all natural. But humans with agriculture or fertilizer on golf courses or construction sites that are eroding sediment, or people's lawns that have excess fertilizer,
or bad boating practices,
that those things wash in then more of the nutrients, and then you're going to heighten that, which is the cultural eutrophication.
Yeah. So at places like Oppenheim Woods, it's open to the public. Do you have problems with humans impacting that environment?
No, not too much. That a place like Oppenheim, I think, is a little more resilient than some of the more sensitive, more sensitive remnant situations, right? If I were to manage, for instance, a remnant prairie, probably wouldn't let people in it.
So explain what a remnant prairie is.
Or at least it would be a lot more regulated, right? I'd be like, listen, a remnant situation is we'll say historic, ancestral, pre-colonial. Okay. There's very little remnant habitat left in Indiana. And so when I think about remnant situations, I don't necessarily consider Oppenheim remnant. It's certainly old, right? And I also think that, it's a situation like that. I think that, it can handle the amount of visitation that it gets. There's certain things that I don't let, mountain biking, for instance, things that are going to disturb the soil. We try to mitigate the introduction of invasive species with boot brush and signs and things like that. And I regularly, patrol the trail to make sure that certain invasive species aren't in there, and we work to manage them. But that's sort of, that job is never done. That's just like making your bed or doing your laundry. It's that sort of vigilance is necessary anytime in any habitat that you manage. But I think Oppenheim is fine with foot traffic and just average traffic. Would I let mountain bikes in? No. Do I let four-wheel, like side-by-sides and things like that in? No. Right. But people are welcome to visit that. On the other hand, there are certain situations where maybe I wouldn't let, I'm willing to take people in like a class or something like that. But as far as just general open to the public, no. Some of the wetlands that I manage and some of the other areas that just are more prone to disturbance because of the soils that they have, the hydrology that it has, the plant and animal communities that are in there. They probably need to be a little more cloistered off and protected.
So they're more sensitive to impact.
Yeah, and like any of the remnant communities that we have, whether you're talking about prairie, remnant ephemeral pools in forests, any sort of remnant situation is also going to be, sort of a reservoir of biodiversity. So another big part of my job is restoration work. Not only do I just take care of like a place like Oppenheim Woods, TNC, the Nature Conservancy, whom I work for, and my job in particular, we do a lot of restoration work where, I guess you could say the general strategy with the Nature Conservancy is to acquire a parcel of land and protect it that has a high conservation value. Maybe it has, an undisturbed forest in it, or it has a creek in it that is of particular high quality and contains, a good diversity of organisms. Or maybe it's a wetland that, for the same reasons, is largely, intact hydrology, intact relatively undisturbed soils with a good diversity of organisms, right? So that's like your protection target. And then what we do is we build out from that, right? And try to restore as much as we can. It's not always possible. Oppenheim, for instance, is kind of landlocked with Lake Tippecanoe in the south and the golf course on the north, right?
And a road on the
right,
east, yeah.
right. And so that's not always possible. But where we can do that sort of thing, we do a lot of that restoration work. And to your point about humans speeding up the life cycle, right? That's another way that you can sort of speed up the maturation, the life cycle of something. Human-induced eutrophication is, broadly speaking, I think generally speaking, a negative thing.
Right.
Right. But, human-induced diversification and restoration, it's the same thing. We're pushing it down the road faster. Nevertheless, it still takes a very long time.
So I know that you have discovered some plants that I think the phrase that was used was extirpated.
Extirpated.
Yeah, explain that.
Well, I didn't discover it, but I was with Scott Nemesnik, the state botanist for the DNR, a friend of mine, and we were in, Burkett Bog here in Kosciusko County, and we found a plant that had been listed as extinct, locally extinct in Indiana. It's a plant that Scott had been looking for, I think, for maybe 10, 15 years or more.
Wow.
And we walked right by it. We had been in there doing botanical surveys, and I think it was maybe the first time Scott was in there with me, but we were in there doing some botanical surveys. It's a very nondescript plant. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking specifically for it. But when you find it, because it just looks like grass, it's aerograss. The genus species is Schuchzeria palustris, when we just call it Schuchzeria. It's not at all rare globally. It's very common in northern latitudes. So it's a sort of a more boreal species. But Indiana's, for a lot of boreal species, northern Indiana is like the last stop before you're too far south.
Okay. And
this is one of them. And so Scott actually found that plant. We had crossed by the area where he found it 3 or 4 times that day, and we were actually on our way out of the bog, and I heard Scott exclaim out loud and turned around, and he's on his knees looking at something with a hand lens and, chatting up a storm.
Like a true botanist.
Yeah.
Right?
So we went back over, and sure enough, there it was. And then once we had our search image in our head of what this plant looked like, we started looking and like, oh, it's everywhere.
Oh, cool.
Oh, cool.
But it just, in a bog, it's a lot of peat moss and sphagnum, a lot of what you would call heathy plants or ericaceous plants. So, there's like cranberries, and there's leatherleaf, and there's a lot of plants that are really specific to a bog.
And sometimes carnivorous plants.
And carnivorous
like
plants,
sundew and Venus flytrap. And
That's right. And well, yeah, there are sundews, in our bogs here in Indiana.
Okay.
Pitcher plants as well. And so it was a really hard plant to see because it's very fine, grass-like, and there were other fine grass-like sedges all around it and some other things. But once we sort of got our search image, we're like, oh, there it is. It's literally everywhere in here.
So I think for our listeners and viewers, Susie, we've talked about wetlands a number of times on this podcast series, and bogs are a specific type of wetland. So we've talked about wetlands. You could have a marsh, which is going to be more herbaceous or green plants, think cattails or those sorts of things. You can have a swamp, which is usually more of a wooded wetland where you have woody species like trees or buttonbush or something like that. You can have a bog, which typically is going to have that sphagnum mat on the top and some plants growing in it, sometimes even trees. Like, isn't there a spruce that can grow, like a black spruce or something?
Tamarack, and there's some spruces that'll go. Red maples will pop up in them, yeah.
Yeah, but that bog is very different in that typically you'll have rainwater, which is slightly acidic, comes to a depression in the landscape. And with that acidity, then you've got the sphagnum, which reinforces the acidity. And so only certain plants and animals probably will live in the bog. We've talked about fens on this podcast as well. That's more where you have groundwater coming out, which is going to have a higher pH. And so that would be a different sort of a wetland than a bog, which is going to have a more acidic pH. But yeah, talk about what would be some of the amphibians and reptiles that you'd find around a bog.
I mean, you would find, so specifically in bogs, like what I might consider ones that, of course you're going to see garter snakes. You would see decay snakes, right? You would see snapping turtles and painted turtles and all your normal guys, but you could see those in lakes and pretty much anywhere too. In a bog, in Indiana, you would expect to see maybe some rare things, spotted turtles being one. Blanding's turtles, they're not really totally localized to bogs, but they would utilize bogs as well. Eastern Massasaugas could be found in a bog.
Wait a minute, is that a rattlesnake?
It's a rattlesnake.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's one of our few venomous snakes in this area, right?
It is. And it's the only venomous species in northern Indiana.
Okay.
Ranging up into all the way through the lower peninsula of Michigan and up into southern Ontario.
I've heard people talk about timber rattlesnakes. Are those
southern Indiana?
Okay.
Especially in like Brown County.
Okay.
But you would see Eastern Massasaugas. They would also be in fens as well. And so the thing is, you'd mentioned fens. Bogs and fens, while they have different, we'll say, hydrologies, different water sources, a bog is isolated from the groundwater, and it's rainwater fed. It typically doesn't have an inlet or an outlet. It's just basically a bowl that fills with rainwater, right? Fens are related to bogs, and fens can transition in the bogs as well. So as fens age, to get back to life cycles, as fens age and they start to, fens also, they're both called peatlands, meaning they have sphagnum moss, peat. As fens get older, they can actually deposit enough organic peat down that isolates them from the groundwater. And at that point, then, you would see a shift in the chemistry of the fen from, being circumneutral or just around pH of 7, or, slightly more alkaline, we'll say, to now it start to transition because of the physiology and the chemistry of the plants and the deposition of organic material. You could start to see a transition to a more acidic pH of the water. And so the fen starts to isolate itself from the groundwater, and the chemistry starts to change, and it can actually transition into a bog or a more bog-like condition. Actually, Burkett has a good example of that.
Now, will a bog carry it to its conclusion like I did for a lake? Would a bog eventually get enough of that moss build up that it goes to a wet prairie and a forest and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah, it'll definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, eventually it would, right? So, the bog is this depression. It's cut off from the groundwater. It's precipitation filled. It starts to develop, peat mats. If you could think about I'm trying to think. I'm trying to illustrate something. If I could draw it, it would be easier, right? But if you picture a bowl, right?
Yeah.
And the vegetation starts to encroach from the outside. So the bog, a lot of bogs, will have open water in the middle, right? But then there will be this floating sort of veg mat, right? Of dead organic, vegetation, and then growing vegetation on top. And so it kind of gets like a quaking bog.
Yeah.
It can be pretty soft.
I love taking my students out on bogs because it's not as common anymore for people to have water beds.
Yeah.
But it's what I would imagine it would be like walking on a water bed, because you have the sphagnum and it's floating. The mat is floating on the water. So as you walk and as other people are walking around you, you can sort of feel waves in it, and sometimes there's weak spots and the students will fall in, and it's so exciting.
Yeah. I've
Yeah.
worked a lot in those situations. I remember the first time I went into a fen that was because fens can be like that too.
Yeah.
I was falling through, and I was all alone, and I was getting pretty frustrated, and I was looking for a snake, and I wasn't finding it, and I had never been in the fen before. I was just told, go here and look for this snake, and I said, all right. And I kept falling through, and I kept pulling myself up on these shrubs that were growing in the fen.
So when you fell through, how deep how do you fall?
Well, I always tell the students, put your arms out when you fall out, because else you could just keep going down into that
it
water
depends.
layer.
I mean, I've gone through, up to like my armpits before.
Yeah.
But I'm pulling myself out of these shrubs, and it turns out the shrubs were poison sumac.
I was just wondering that when you said that.
So like I didn't realize. I about halfway through the day, I had been pulling myself up, and then I realized what I was grabbing onto. I was like, oh, and I got a pretty bad case of poison sumac,
because there's a higher uracil, that alcohol in there that causes the allergic reaction than poison ivy and poison sumac.
Oh yes,
so
absolutely.
It's a much worse allergic reaction.
It is a worse allergic reaction. But the bog eventually, right, it will, as it deposits more, just like a lake, as more organic material gets deposited, it starts to close off that open water at the top. And eventually it just keeps depositing more and more organic material. It becomes more and more solid. Trees take root. Once trees start to take root and woody species start to take root, they suck up a lot of water. And so they start to dry things out. And I mean, this takes thousands of years. It transitions from, a wetland into more of an upland situation. And at Burkitt Bog, there had been studies done, and some boring had been done at Burkitt Bog. The organic peat layer at Burkitt is, I think, almost 16 or 17 meters deep.
Wow.
Which, that's 40, what? Geez, oh man, that's got to be close to 50 feet, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is there still like open water down below that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't. Swinehart did those studies, and I have the report for Burkitt.
Yeah.
But I think these were done maybe like 15, 20 years ago.
Okay.
And I don't know exactly how saturated things are underneath, but I know that like a lot of times bogs will have a moat around the outside of them that makes them difficult to enter. And Burkitt is no exception. And so you have to wade through this very deep, very muddy moat. And then you climb out onto the peat. But once you're out on the peat, it's really stable. But like Elkhart Bog that I had mentioned, north of here, up in Elkhart, that one is really soft. And I don't know how much of that is attributed to alter hydrology or not. I imagine some of it is, but that one's very soft. Rich Dunbar was the ecologist for DNR, Northeast Regional Ecologist for DNR, retired recently. I remember we were out there a few years ago, and it took us like 2 hours to walk out 70 meters and turn around and come back because we were just like, wobbling
and sometimes
and
it feels like the video games like Mario Brothers, where you're like the little character and you have to jump on a platform, and then as soon as you jump on it, it starts to sink, and so you got to jump to the next platform.
Right,
that can be what it's like on a bog sometimes.
Absolutely,
it starts sinking. You got to quick get to the next one.
Absolutely.
Next one.
Okay, so we want to make sure that our listeners and viewers understand bogs. Burkitt Bog is not accessible for the public.
It is not,
because it's so special. It's not something you want to open up to the public. It's fragile, right?
Right. I mean, also just legally, it's totally landlocked by our private property owned by neighbors.
Okay.
So
whereas Elkhart is one that would be accessible
and
for the public to go see, and there's a platform and a boardwalk so people can interact with it without negative implications.
That's right. And the thing about, like, when we talk about sensitive, I mean, fens and bogs, wetlands, prairies, a lot of these places, more so than forests, are really, really diverse, diverse habitats. And if they're not super diverse, like Burkitt's not necessarily super diverse, but a lot of times almost everything that's in a bog is rare because it's specialized to the chemistry and the conditions of that bog. Right. So a lot of times, like the plants, the sphagnum, the leatherleaf, which is a low growing shrub, that arrowgrass that I mentioned. There's bog rosemary, which looks like rosemary. It doesn't smell like rosemary. It's not an herb. It's just called Andromeda. Is the genus. It's, it's just a shrub That's a bog obligate species. When you get, and there's sedges that are basically bog obligate, like few-fruited sedge, Carex oligosperma, which is few-fruited sedge. So there's a lot of species that are adapted to be in that low pH, low nutrient, like stressful environment. And that's the only place that they can outcompete other plants and animals. And so that's where they're found.
And that's why we think bogs are common places for some of these carnivorous plants as well.
Absolutely.
Because the carnivorous plant, meaning it's eating insects or small amphibians or something, because it's using those animals as an extra nutrient source, because there's not a lot of nutrients around it in the environment that it can soak up through its roots.
Yeah, and nitrogen's the big one. So because in like a peatland, like a fen or a bog, because you also see carnivorous plants in fens, especially in like rich fen situations where it's really close to the water table and it's really close to the soil, like the mineral soil. They're low nutrient situations, and that the main nutrient there in terms of availability is nitrogen. And so nitrogen is in the tissues of plants and animals. It's a common component, especially of proteins. But because you don't get a lot of decay in a bog, and instead you just get this stacking of organic material that basically, for lack of a better word, is mummified, right, in the soil, that nitrogen is never let loose. And so the plants that are adapted to, like carnivorous plants that are adapted to get nitrogen from other sources, what they do is, like a pitcher plant, a bee or something like that is around the edge of the cup on the pitcher plant. It falls down inside, it drowns, it slowly decays. As it decays in the water, in the basin of the pitcher plant, it releases the nitrogen. And so the plant can then acquire that nutrient to build protein and to metabolize.
Yeah, those pitcher plants I think are just amazing because they've got, so it's a pitcher vat, sort of as you were saying, digestive juices down in the bottom. It's got sort of a little flap over the top, almost like a little umbrella to keep rainwater from kind of filling it up and diluting it. And as the insect goes in, there's hairs that are pointing downward, almost like one-way valves, so the insects can't crawl back out. There's sort of a waxy covering that kind of flakes off and makes the insect fall down into the bottom, and then it digests it down there. I just think it's a fascinating sort of a plant. Really cool.
And about how much time? You said it takes a very long time for a bog to mature that might then allow it to be something different than a bog. Can we point to any places in our community where that's already happened?
I'm sure, but I don't know. There's so little natural, like in Kosciusko County, and in Indiana in general, there's very little original state land, right? There are, I guess, markers. It will say historical markers, evidence of what things were. We talk about soils. You can look at just general like landform, and you can get an idea of glacial deposits and things like that. So there's evidence that stuff was there. But as far as a specific example on the ground, I can't really think of one, because if it had been converted, right, if a lake had succeeded into a grassland or a forest or a bog or something like that, it probably would have been cleared and developed. And with the pitcher plants too, another thing that I don't recommend doing, but I see a lot of pitcher plants in my work. If you find a pitcher that has sort of like fallen off, you know what I mean? Because it's a modified leaf, and so they die. It's part of the plant. It gets old and drops off and dies. If you find one, and if I find one in the field and I break it open, it's just like an owl pellet. There's just all these pieces of insect down there. All the pieces of exoskeleton. So I imagine if I were an entomologist,
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And you had a better handle on identifying insects based on the individual little components of them. I imagine I could treat a pitcher plant like an owl pellet,
Right.
and pull it apart and see what was in there.
You could do like an insect survey based on what's in the bottom of the pitcher plant.
Yeah, I bet you could. I don't know if it would be more cost effective than just doing eDNA in this day and age, but it would be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Are there lands in Kosciusko County or any of the counties that you're serving that you hope to acquire?
The Nature Conservancy generally does not talk about things like that.
Oh,
Because the price would suddenly go up then.
yeah,
right?
and also we don't like to count our chickens before they're hatched, right?
yeah.
And so there are properties across, Indiana that we have eyes on, and Kosciusko County is an area of our focus.
so for example, the Oppenheim Woods you acquired because Mr. and Mrs. Oppenheim chose to gift that to
Correct.
the Nature Conservancy before they died.
Mhm.
And they had a relationship, they understood what Nature Conservancy was about.
That's right.
Plus, they were very good stewards of that land that they cared for 60 years before they died.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
So that's one way you acquire land.
That's one way, is through bequeathal and personal relationships and donations from, I guess, conservation-minded landowners.
Right.
And another way is, to just outright purchase something, which, we recently did over in Steuben County. We purchased 265 acres of 265 acres of forest, old field, and agricultural land that's directly adjacent. It touches one of our preserves.
Okay. So you're
We're
growing
tacking
that
on and
preserve.
we're growing it out. And so we'll just straight up purchase. Another way that we protect is to work through partnerships. We don't necessarily purchase and then sit on the land and own it forever. We transfer a lot of stuff. So like other regional land trusts, other regional conservation partners, including DNR, acres,
Mhm.
Sycamore Land Trust. There's a lot of land trusts in Indiana, niches. A lot of times we'll assist them. And so, we might purchase something and say, hey, we'll assist with this. We got the money to do it. It's an important place. And then at some point in the future, maybe immediately or some point down the road, we transfer that over to them. When we do a transfer like that, though, we emphasize that it's important that the organization or the group that is taking over the land has the capacity and the intent to manage it long term.
You want it to be sustainable.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people want to go visit Oppenheim Woods. It's north of Tippecanoe off of Colorado Drive.
Correct.
And there's a lovely parking space there.
Mm-hmm.
You got designated as a bicentennial. There's some kind of special designation for that.
It was the parking lot was funded with bicentennial funds in 2016. We applied for a bicentennial grant to basically make that improvement for visitors, because at that point, before then, there was no real public access for our neighbors or any other interested individuals unless they walked in from Pat Oppenheim's old place, right? And they were a direct neighbor of ours with a relationship to the current the current owner of the Oppenheim's home. So in order to make that more accessible, we applied for a grant. We made the intention to create a parking area suitable for 3 to 5 cars. Not a lot of visitation, and we do get we do get a lot of local interest and a lot of local visitation to that site. I think a lot of the neighbors along Kalorama Road, they really enjoy just walking down the road, and hopping on the trail and going for a run or going for a walk. And it has, in the neighborhood, it's everybody's private little preserve. I think a lot of people think of it, and that's fine. It has an outstanding spring wildflower display.
best stand of trilliums.
It has so many trilliums, and that. You're well familiar with that. It's if you go in there at the right time in the back half of April, it looks like there's snow on the ground in areas because there's so many trilliums. Yeah. So it is outstanding to look at that time. It's nice all year. Yeah.
Is the pathway gravel, dirt? Is there boardwalk area?
There's no boardwalk. It's all natural surface. The Oppenheims maintained mowed paths through the area. We shuttered some of those. There were multiple pathways that sort of crossed through the middle of the preserve. And we decided to instead sort of shutter those and close those, no longer maintain them, and maintain basically a loop around it. So number one, that helps protect the interior of the preserve,
Mm-hmm.
right? It gives the plants and animals a little bit of breathing room, so to speak. It cuts down on, I guess, pathways or vectors that invasive plants can get in, right? And to that extent, then when you're at a nature preserve, it's important to check if they get a boot brush, use that boot brush, and stay on the trail, because the manager of that nature preserve or the manager of that park, that then they can focus. It is time intensive and arduous work to work on invasive species. And if you can help the land manager out or the caretaker for a site by staying on designated pathways, they can focus their attention on those designated pathways to detect, invasion, by, something new or something particularly bad.
So you're saying somebody maybe has a seed in the tread of their shoe
Mm-hmm.
or stuck to their clothing, which many plants have adaptations.
That's
so
right.
their seeds are sticky in that way. If someone's way in the interior, away from a trail, that seed falls off and it starts growing.
That's right.
An invasive species that then starts multiplying. It might take the land manager years
That's
to
right.
see
And
that.
then it's a real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there partners that you have that help you maintain it?
Yeah. So we work with a local. We work with a local group, QUIP, which is a local SISMA, which is, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, and it's
There's weed wranglers.
They're weed wranglers, right? So there's acronyms upon acronyms, right? So Indiana has SICM, which is, you would think I would remember this, but I never do, because it used to be Southern Indiana.
So we want you, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can look at one of our past episodes with Dugan Julian.
Yes.
Yep.
And Kosciusko County has a very active group of weed wranglers called QUIP, KWIPP. We do an annual weed wrangle at Oppenheim Woods. This year we're doing it, I think, I'd have to look, but it's April 24th, somewhere around there. It's usually like toward the end of April. They've been a great help. We go in and we the main management concern in Oppenheim are invasive shrubs. And so we go in and we do a lot of hand pulling of shrubs.
Asian honeysuckle.
Asian honeysuckle, burning bush. Burning bush is a big one. Barberry. And all of these are common ornamental plants. And, they're found, in the landscaping of our neighbors there. And so, as you mentioned earlier with the birds dispersing cherry seeds, burning bush, honeysuckle,
barberry.
autumn olive, all of those things produce fruit that are eaten by birds, calorie pear, and then they disperse that across the landscape. So, but the QUIP, the local weed wranglers, the local SISMA has really, really helped me tackle, an ever-expanding area of shrubs. It's amazing. We've done this. I think this will be the 4th year that we've done it. And, I mean, you can just tell where we've been working and where we haven't been working. And we don't use any herbicide during this. It's not a good time to apply herbicide to shrubs in the early spring. So, we go in and we just manually pull them up. The soils are such, and usually the ground is soft enough that you can pull up a burning bush or something like that with no problem.
Yeah, and we've sponsored and partnered with that organization a number of times over the last few years. And so if folks are interested in helping with those, they can look at our events on the Lilly Center website, and we can keep people informed about helping with that in the future. Yeah,
they're a great group. It's a lot of fun. I try to get out with them. It's crazy because I do that for a living, but then I go help people in my spare time once in a while to go do it too. But, it's a lot of fun.
Nathan Herbert, we sure appreciated you being here today to inform us about Oppenheim Woods and Burkett Bog and all of the interesting features that we have that we're blessed with. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was great. I could go for hours if you let me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lake Doctor Podcast. You can share your thoughts or submit questions by leaving a comment or sending an email to lakes@grace.edu.
Listening to this podcast is just the first step to making your lake cleaner and healthier. Visit lakes.grace.edu for more information about our applied research and discover some tangible ways you can make a difference on your lake.
Please like and share this podcast. We'll see you next time. The doctor is in.